Let's start with your public involvement in this debate. You've been someone who has, in an early way, some would argue in a precedent way, warned about this war before many ever believed that it could have happened. What did you see in terms of Russia-Ukraine relations, Russia-NATO relations, that gave you some confidence in predicting that there was indeed a very high risk of what is now, unfortunately, arguably the largest war in Europe since World War II?
You know, certainly the largest war and a tragic occurrence. I think the thing that I noticed, along with a number of other people, was that the United States and its allies in NATO were progressively moving closer and closer to Russia and getting closer and closer to threatening what Russians would regard as vital national security interests. NATO began expanding in 1999 with Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, then had a series of additional expansions, all moving again closer to Russia. And each time, the Russians made it clear that this made them very nervous. Not surprising, this is the world's most powerful alliance, moving steadily closer to Russia, having also made it a point that Russia was not going to be a member, that Russia wasn't going to be invited to join or anything like that. And then finally in 2008, the United States proposed Ukraine and Georgia for NATO membership over the objections of European leaders who understood how sensitive Russia would be to trying to bring Ukraine and Georgia in. And as I kept watching this, I kept saying, at some point there's going to be a Russian reaction. Russia has tolerated this up until now, partly because it was weak and couldn't do very much about it, partly because Ukraine and Georgia, Ukraine in particular, were different than, say, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, even the Baltic states. And the Russians made it very clear, not just Vladimir Putin, but other Russian leaders as well, that they regarded this as a mortal threat to their security in ways that should be relatively easy for us to understand. The United States, for example, has the Monroe Doctrine and says that, you know, great powers should stay out of the entire Western Hemisphere. The United States went to war in Iraq, a country on the other side of the world, because we thought Saddam Hussein was a mortal danger. It was not surprising that Russia was sensitive about this, and there was going to be a point where they would react. That point starts in 2014, after the Maidan uprising, where Viktor Yanukovych is overthrown. The United States is somewhat involved in that process, and Russia responds by seizing Crimea. That's a warning sign that they really do take this very seriously. And then beginning in, I would say, about 2017, when Ukraine is beginning to be drawn into de facto alignment with the West, we're starting to arm them, we're starting to train them. The Russians warn us again that they're serious about this, and in 2021, Putin begins to mobilize forces and says, if you don't start paying attention to our security interests here, we're going to do something about it, which turns out to be a threat that he meant.
Let me end by asking you a question that I'm going to ask to all the participants before the debate, which is, if you can, and this is purely speculative, so play along with me, but if you cast your mind forward 5 years from now, what could this conflict look like? How could possibly Europe have changed? What relative position and standing would you see Russia, Ukraine, and the West in 5 years out?
Yeah, well, obviously this will depend on how the war proceeds and how it is ultimately settled, and let's hope it is settled as soon as possible. I think there's no question that Russia will be relatively weaker as a result of this. I think its economy will be damaged by this. I think it's going to have trouble getting access to sophisticated technology. There's going to be some brain drain out of Russia, very talented Russians. So in terms of Russia's long-term power potential, it will already have suffered losses here. They may think those losses were worth it if they were able, as a result of the end game, to ensure that Ukraine remained a neutral country, didn't align or join NATO. But they're still going to be weaker, relatively speaking. I think Europeans have been reminded that hard power matters, that you can't rely just on international law and the European Union and institutions to maintain the peace, and that you have to be mindful of other countries' interests, but you have to have some capacity to defend yourself as well. I think that's going to be a lesson that's drawn from it as well. And finally, Ukraine is going to be in terrible shape. because this war has been hugely destructive to Ukraine, and the longer it continues, the more destruction Ukraine is going to suffer. And Ukraine, hopefully 5 years from now, is in the process of rebuilding, but it has been a tragedy for Ukraine, no less, and they're the ones who are suffering the most damage here.